right. Welcome everybody to week 2 of 150 on communications. I'm excited for tonight. We've got a few different things we need to cover as far as the coursework, some of the assigned readings. We'll go over just a little bit of those, kind of a basic overview, and then go over a few more tips and strategies for effective communication within the workplace. So hopefully we can accomplish a lot of good material. Last week we spent some time with expectations and course issues that we don't have to tonight, so we've got a little bit more time. Jonna, thanks again for joining in tonight. Appreciate that. It makes me a more effective communicator, as an aside, when I have somebody to actually communicate to as opposed to just the air. So I appreciate you being here and interacting throughout the evening. I think it makes it better for everybody, myself and the participants that might view this later. This is an interesting class because there's no way to track. Well, there is a way to track. I can see who reviews the recording each week, but there's no way for us to, score that or anything like that or give you extra credit. It's against school policy. However, it's mandatory and required to review this. But in a class like this, where there's no tests and there's no really hard homework assignments or anything like that, sometimes I think it creates a situation where a few people just decide not to attend the session. So I really appreciate you, Jonna, for participating, and for those of you who will be reviewing this later when you can on your own time, I appreciate that as well. Hopefully we'll fill it full of good material that you can take with you into the workplace beyond this class, and maybe into your families, maybe into other relationships that you have. You can practice some of these things. All of the material that we talk about can be improved, right? So we talked about last week that we can work at these communication skills. We talked about last week how if we practice speaking, that'll help our communication, our oral communication skills. If we practice listening, that'll also help our communication skills. We're going to talk a little bit more about listening, active listening this evening. We're going to talk a little bit more, and this might not seem related, but in communication it's so important, and that is controlling our emotions when it comes to communication. And as we talk about that, I'm sure you'll see how that really plays into effective communication once we get to that. Now, Jonna, you might have already read both articles, and hopefully we won't bore you by just regurgitating the material from those articles. I'll try to make it interesting, give you some work examples, and then I've got some additional material that I'd like to cover tonight about some related communication effectiveness topics. Before I get started, I did want to make the slides go. Did the slide just move on you, Jonna? Sometimes it gets caught if I sit on it on my end for too long and doesn't move. Are you seeing the slide that says interview on top? All right, thank you. So this week for the course material, all we have to do is a short interview with someone else. The instructions this week ask for you to interview someone that you view as an effective communicator. And so one of the things that I'd like you to do is to explain to those of us who are reading your discussion post why you chose the person that you did. And so you can imagine that, because it's my spouse and they're easy to interview, or because I work with them and they're easy to interview, is probably not what the instructions are really calling for. The instructions are calling for some thought about why that person would be somebody effective to have an interview with about effective communication, right? So don't go and find the person that you think struggles the most with communication. Go find someone who you look at and say, you know what, they're a very good communicator. They're very good at communicating ideas and thoughts, and so that would be an excellent way to complete this assignment this week. Jonna, many people in the class probably would be in your same boat, meaning many of us don't have a lot of great communicators around us all the time, and maybe some of the people that we do, it's in a work environment that maybe isn't conducive to an interview like this, but hopefully you'll be able to come up with somebody, and maybe just the best of the folks that are around you. Doesn't necessarily mean they're excellent communicators, right, Jonna, but maybe they're just better than others, and can give you some insight in what they think an effective communicator does, even if they're not really, really good at it. Yeah, 4-year-old grandson's probably a very effective verbal communicator, right? Um, and maybe not effective verbal communicator, but a very good verbal communicator, meaning that there's a lot of that verbal communication going on, right? Yes, and very genuine. And frankly, we go full circle with that. We become very good at communicating, and then we have to try very hard to be genuine and honest in how we communicate. People sometimes, and politicians are an excellent example of this, they get so good at communicating, they're such good communicators that the truth gets kind of lost in how they perform, right, when it comes to communication. It's like a performance for them, it's an art. And so sometimes the honesty part, the genuineness gets lost in them trying to put on a good show or give a good speech, right? So, and as an aside, that's why a lot of people don't like politicians, because they feel like it's more about trying to give a good talk or a good speech and less about trying to be upfront and honest with people and genuine. All right, so we've got that interview, and then just a +3 here, just a reminder that it's not just 3 posts for the week like it sometimes is in other classes. It's you do the main post, and then we need 3 more discussion points, or discussion posts added to the board as well. So your main post is due by Wednesday at midnight. That's consistent. And then we need 4 total posts this week, 3 additional conversation posts with your peers. Once again, just as an aside, fulfill the requirement by completing the interview, but also know that you can accomplish full credit if you demonstrate that you've read the required material, right? So one of the good things to do in these main discussion posts, especially, but you could do it in the conversation with your peers, with those conversation posts, the other peer conversation posts that you have. But either way, you need to find opportunities to demonstrate to me that you've read the material that's required for the week, right? Because it's required, and I don't have any other way of knowing unless you demonstrate through what you write about and how you write that you've had that, okay? Yeah, so you've got the main post, is where you include the interview, right? Information about the interview, and it can be very brief. Just give us some feedback from your interview, some basic points, maybe something you thought was interesting that was shared, and whether or not you agree or disagree, those kinds of things. And then, yes, along with your experience as far as, what makes good communicators in your experience as well. And I think that's what you mean by that question, right, Jonah? Or is there something else you were asking? Yeah, no problem. The bulk of it will be the interview, but I definitely want you to include some of your feedback as well. Okay, your own personal feedback, both to what the person who you interview says and also to the questions themselves from your interview. Okay. As far as last week's discussion board, I mentioned on the announcement board that I thought the discussion board was going very well. There are a handful of you, of course, who have not completed the discussion post for last week, and I'm hopeful that I'll see those come in right away so that you get caught up and don't feel overwhelmed at the end and still are able to get the grade and pass the class. I do accept late work, however, I can't award full credit. Just as an aside, the school mandates that I have all the grading done by Wednesday at noon for the previous week. I don't like to grade as I go. I feel like I'm not as I can't have as much equality in my scoring if I grade one day and then wait a few days and grade some more. And so what I'll usually do in this course is do all the grading Monday night after our session so that late Monday night, first thing Tuesday morning, you have all your grades from the previous week and some feedback. If you have any questions about the feedback or your grade, get in touch with me right away, but expect that by Tuesday, you'll always have your grades and feedback for the previous week. Okay? And then late work, no guarantees. I just get to late work as I can. It'll always be graded by the end of the course, but I definitely prioritize the on-time work before the late work, just as a heads up. Okay, any questions on grading, when to expect grades, Jonna? Anything that I can clarify there? All right, we're in good shape then. If anybody else, as you are listening, have any questions concerning grades, just make sure and be in touch with me. In 6 years, I have made some mistakes in grades, so if you see something that doesn't look right, boy, don't be shy, right? Make sure that you zip me an email right away, and there's absolutely no harm or foul as far as asking, why you have the grade that you got or got the feedback that you got. And every once in a while, and it's not very common, but every once in a while we'll have a situation where there's just a mistake in the grading. And so um, double check it, make sure that you've looked at it and it makes sense. And as long as it does, move forward. If it doesn't, touch base. There may be a good reason, or it may be a mistake, and it's worth checking. Okay. I'll try to practice my effective communication with you if you have any concerns about your grades, and we'll have a constructive conversation about your thoughts and what I was thinking about the score that you received. All right. So I mentioned there are a couple articles this week. The first one I thought was very good. It talked about 10 different tips for becoming a better listener. The other one was about controlling emotions, and I mentioned at the beginning that topic might not sound like it applies really to communication, but it absolutely does, and it's very topical. But before we get to that, John, this may be kind of strange, but listening ends up being such a critical part of communicating. Communication, and especially effective communication between two different individuals, needs to be more than one person being able to speak well, right? And in fact, I think all of us can come up with people in our lives, different examples of people in our lives who are very good at arguing, very good at communicating, very good at making a point, okay, and defending something that they believe in. And it doesn't necessarily mean that they're effective communicators, because if they ramrod their ideas onto us, and if we feel like they never are reciprocating, meaning allowing us to share ideas and allowing us to share feedback, they may, in the end, be a very ineffective communicator, a good speaker, but ineffective at communicating ideas and having people understand. Remember how we talked about last week? It's more than just communicating, it's effectively communicating, which means that you need to have people understand, and you need to have people be able to remember, what the message was and do something about it, be motivated to do something about it, not just listen, right? Yes. So, like you said, there are people in our lives that sometimes are very good at speaking, but are very poor listeners, and people who are poor listeners may still be very charismatic. They may be very good at whatever work, environment they have, but they don't end up getting our respect, and they also are not nearly as effective as they could be if they validated others, if they accepted others' ideas, if they listened. And so I think this is a critically important issue, and of course we can see it very clearly between spouses and family members, but it happens all the time between co-employees, and between especially between the sometimes the gap between managers and employees, right? Managers think that they're the be all end all, and so sometimes they communicate that way and don't listen or accept ideas or validate other people's opinions at any given point. Okay, and that creates a barrier, and then we're not effective anymore as far as our communication. So the 10 different ideas or concepts that this article talks about specifically, I thought all were very good. One of them is, the first one was just talking about how our face and our eyes need to have a nonverbal communication going on with the person that demonstrates that we're listening, right, and we're paying attention. You've probably been in a situation where you're talking to somebody and you feel like their eyes are wandering, or you feel like they're distracted, or you feel like they're fidgety, or you feel like they just can't give you 100% of what you're to what you're talking about. And while that person may have a legitimate reason for that interruption or that impatience, most times, whether or not it's legitimate or not, it creates a circumstance where the person communicating doesn't feel validated, doesn't feel like that person respects or is demonstrating, concern or consideration for what they're saying. And so it's just so important, that we practice eye contact. And also that our face demonstrates the positioning of our face in the direction of the person talking, instead of off to the side, down, somewhere different. Okay. Oh, Jonna, demonstrating that you already read it. Appreciate that. So your favorite part was do not step on the end of other speakers' words. Wait. So that goes down to the pause, right? So pause in order to clarify. Don't cut people off before they finish their thought, right? So we can be trying to clarify, trying to be an interactive listener, and because we're overzealous in our efforts, we can actually hurt the conversation by how active we're demonstrating our listening is, right? So we talk about how we want to be active listeners, but if you're overactive and you cut people off, or you speak too quickly after they're completed, in an unnatural way, you end up coming across like, once again, you're impatient, your ideas are more important than that person's, and even if it's unintended, you have basically downplayed or minimized what that person was trying to communicate. So excellent. Glad you remembered that. The second point they talked about was to be attentive and relaxed. And I thought this was a great mix. We often talk, and you'll often hear about being attentive, right? We need to act like we're attentive, and we all can think of or examples. We can all think of examples of people being attentive that are very good attentive listeners. However, being overly attentive or being anxious, looking like you're anxious when you're trying to be attentive, can have the opposite effect, where somebody feels like you're anxious about what they're saying, or you're anxious for them to be done talking. And so you leave it open for them to assume that you're just, once again, downplaying or minimizing the importance of what they're trying to say. And you can leave them feeling less important and less understood than what you would mean to. Okay, so a good mix of being relaxed, okay, not being high strung, but also being active and attentive when somebody's speaking. I thought another good one was to have an open mind. And this takes sometimes a lot of effort, especially if it's somebody that we disagree with, or somebody that's disagreeable, or somebody that we just have so many differences with that sometimes we find ourselves thinking, man, I just don't have anything in common with this person. I really don't get along with them. Sometimes this happens, well, I shouldn't even say sometimes, this often happens in the workplace, right? We work with people that aren't like us, and by design, we put teams together of people who are not alike, and on purpose, so that we can get a job done, and people's traits and qualities can complement one another, and we can have an effective workplace. Well, that desire to have an effective workplace and having personalities that complement one another can sometimes create some friction, right? We have different people, different personalities, different cultures and backgrounds, and sometimes that creates some serious barriers in how we communicate one with another. And it's really important to start, finish, complete every task with as much of an open mind as we possibly can. Taking what people have to say, how they say it, trying to give them the benefit of the doubt, and trying to give their ideas as much of a say and of credence than anything we would have as far as an idea. So the trick is to think of their idea on par as far as value, no matter what it is, with anything that we had to suggest or any ideas that we have. And you might say, well, what if their idea is not as good as our idea? Or what if it's not, that's already us trying to judge, right? And trying to close off from new ideas. One of the key managerial concepts for finance, so if you end up studying any kind of finance or business management, is this concept of TQM, which kind of came out of, it came out of Japan. And TQM stands for Total Quality Management. And the idea behind TQM, and companies like Toyota that did it very well, was that we have this flat employee structure, meaning instead of having this hierarchy, right, where you have a manager and then a manager's manager and then a manager's manager, and those folks never talk to the underlings, right, the employees. You always go to the mid-level manager first, or the supervisor. So there's definitely those lines of communication still, but in more of a flat culture or a TQM culture. The idea is that even the janitor, anybody that works there, can come with ideas and suggestions and concerns, and that opening that line of communication from everyone, no matter where they work within the company, creates a total quality management situation where the overall quality goes up exponentially. Instead of having grunt workers, what we'd call grunt or blue collar workers that are on the line, manufacturing something, and they see something wrong or have very good suggestions but don't have any outlet to share those, or if they do, they're looked, as less than, somebody else's suggestions that's in management. That stifles, opportunities to grow and to become better as a company. So TQM is that whole idea of having an open mind, and no matter what your position, allowing ideas and then validating ideas coming from everywhere. It doesn't mean that you're going to follow all those ideas, doesn't mean you're going to do them all, but it does mean that you're going to allow anybody to communicate about any idea or concern that they have, no matter who they are and no matter where they work. And you're going to take that information and really have an open mind about it, and even have some serious talks about changing how things go based on that feedback that you get. So we all know of people who ask us for feedback, especially in the workplace, and then really don't have any intention of really taking what we say to heart, right? TQM, to do it effectively, mandates that we take that information and take it seriously and really try to have an open mind about maybe implementing something that they have as a suggestion. So anyway, that's a complete aside, but something you'll learn about if you take some more business management classes. The TQM, or total quality management, having an open mind and taking information and feedback from anywhere within an organization, from the very bottom, communicating directly right to the top about different concerns or ways that they can improve a company or a culture. And it's highly effective when done well, when there's an open mind. Another idea for good listening is visualization. Okay, trying to visualize, what is going on, trying to picture it, right? Yeah, so good, Jonna. So I really appreciate that, because I think most of us are kind of visual learners, right? So if we're hearing something and not able to see anything along with it, sometimes that's a challenge, right? Sometimes even in these classes, when you're taking an online class, it's difficult unless you're a really good listener to get a lot from these classes, because it's hard to just listen and not see the person who's presenting and not be with classmates, in a live setting. Some people will say, I like the online format because of the flexibility, but I don't like it because I don't get as much from these sessions as I do from a live class. And I can't disagree with that. I think it is easier in a live class sometimes to get more from, a session like this, a class like this. So it's a unique challenge, right? But it's also an opportunity for us to become better listeners. And one of the ways that we can do that is through this visualization, where we create visual ties to whatever the person is describing, right? And so even if there's not a lot of fancy movement or video or imagery going on the screen, we can do some of that in our minds. Sometimes it takes some creativity and some imagination, but I think most of us have capacity to be able to create some visualization, and it might take some practice, but it's something I think we can all do, and really helps, especially the memory, right? When we can visualize something, we can memorize much better, we can remember much better the concepts that we were learning. You had mentioned, John, and I thought it was a great comment, that one of your favorite things was to wait for a pause, right? And then even at the pause, wait for a little bit instead of jumping right in with solutions. This is something they talk about, in the Men Are From Mars, Women Are From Venus type books, where they talk about relationships between couples too. And they talk about how men are quick always to try and solve a problem. And as a general rule, and this is not, there are exceptions to everything in those books, of course, but as a general rule, men try to solve problems and try to be problem solvers. And unfortunately, that usually comes across like we're not very good listeners, right? And I say I think I do this quite a bit, where I try to, somebody comes up with a problem, and my impatient approach to it is to try to come up to solve that problem right away and come up with a solution. When in reality, most people don't want you to come up with a solution. They want you to just hear them out and validate what their concern or problem is and help to them to help solve their own problem, right? And thinking through their own problem instead of just throwing different solutions at them, which sometimes just creates more problems, right? When we try to come up with solutions before we validate their concerns. So it's not just a male thing, but it is something that I'll just say that many males have a problem with and struggle with in relationships, especially, and something that we can probably all do a little bit better at, is to wait for that pause and don't jump in, with solutions. Don't jump in, to offer feedback before really trying to digest what the person's saying. Of course, we want to ask to understand and to clarify. With the whole, if I heard you correctly, I understood that you said this, and we don't want to be a broken record and say that exact same line every time we're talking to somebody, because then it sounds forced. But conversationally, we can come up with something that sounds very similar to that, but allows us to verbalize and give feedback to what they just said. Try to be sympathetic or empathetic and at least understand what they said. And if we don't understand, to be open to the clarification. I didn't really understand what you were saying then, when they tell us that it's not really what they thought and we're a little bit off track for some reason. People are just fine with us misunderstanding what they're saying, as long as it doesn't come across like we just weren't listening, right? And secondly, it sounds like a genuine, just misunderstanding, as opposed to trying to argue with what they're feeling, right? We don't want to get the feelings thing wrong. We want to try to demonstrate that we were carefully listening, and then come across as sympathetic and empathetic in how we, especially with concerns, how we, give that back to them when we try to clarify. I was at a work meeting this morning. Somebody was talking about a problem. Most of the people around the table were on their phones, checking different things and getting different work done and listening at the same time. There was a specific gentleman in this meeting that multiple times we'd get to the end of somebody's feedback, a story about a client, a situation, a concern about a client, and he would ask a question when they were done talking that demonstrated to everyone there that he had not been listening, right? So if you're going to ask follow-up questions, just be careful that you've been listening, right? You come across as arrogant, impatient, and like what people are saying is unimportant if at the end of everything that person said, you come up with a question that just demonstrates that you have no idea what they're talking about. So it's kind of disingenuous. It's very disingenuous when you ask a question to fake like you're concerned about what they were saying, and in reality your question demonstrates that you had no clue what they were saying, right? And weren't listening at all. So be careful about that. Make sure that you're actively listening if you're going to try to demonstrate that you've got compassion and at least understanding for what the person said when you try to reiterate what their concern was. You need to be careful about feelings and demonstrate that you understand, or at least are trying to understand how someone feels when they're speaking. You need to give them feedback. Sometimes this is nonverbal, just a nod of the head. Sometimes it's just something very, even the article talks about just very simple, yeses, oh, just any kind of response that seems natural, right? Don't make it, number two, like we talked about, where it's not relaxed anymore. It's kind of crazy. It's over the top. It's too much, right? So don't make it that. But at the same time, make sure that someone understands and can feel that you're actively part of what they're saying. Now, I will say on this one that this is one that I think people get wrong a lot. They think that the more feedback they give somebody while somebody's talking, that somehow that means they're even a better listener or they're even more involved in the conversation. Some people do it so much and do it without even thinking that it's obvious that they're just doing it, right? It doesn't even fit sometimes what the conversation. So anyway, the point is, I think people can overdo the feedback thing and make it over the top to where they're not relaxed or attentive anymore. They're just, yeah, 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 except they're trying, by responding to everything, but it just seems like over the top and disingenuous. I don't know if that makes sense, but I think you'd be able to see a demonstration of it and recognize it better than me trying to describe it when somebody's just kind of doing a little too much with the feedback. And then finally, and we talked about how important this is before, the attention to the nonverbal. So facial expressions, hand expressions, how people are carrying themselves, tone in voice, eyes, what eyes are doing, just all kinds of different nonverbal communication that might be going on in a conversation. A little bit harder for you, Jonna, when I'm, you can't see what I'm doing, as I'm doing it, but different inflections in my voice, things that I say louder or softer, things that I say more quickly, changes in my, inflections in how I say things to emphasize or to de-emphasize different things might carry a lot of meaning. It might also not, right? It might not even be something that I'm thinking about, but it's worth, if you're going to try to be a very good listener, it's worth trying to catch, different things that happen in a conversation that have nothing to do with the words, right? But everything to do with how it was said, and we talked about that last week, how a lot of times it's more important how something is said and less important as far as what is said. How much, Jonna, how much have you lost your hearing, if you don't mind if I ask? And do you have aids, or have you lost hearing in one ear or both ears, or? Interesting. So certain tones just don't come through at all for you? Interesting. Is there any way that, there's something corrective through aids or anything like that you can do to assist, or is it just something? Wow. Yeah, you're in a unique situation that you have to probably overcompensate, right? And really, really try your best to catch everything that's said so that you can compensate for maybe missing a few things. Do you find yourself kind of lip reading or doing, some of the other things that people do when they're losing hearing or have lost hearing, where they try to watch more closely, a face? Yeah. Well, I'm even more impressed that you come to these sessions then, because you can't see my face, right? You can't read my lips, so I'm sure sometimes it's very difficult. Yeah. Well, I would have never ever thought that, because you come across as an excellent listener in these sessions. You do a great job interacting, and I don't feel like you're missing anything. So kudos to you. Just great job. That's amazing that you've learned to deal with that and work with it in such a great way. So that is listening. Okay, let's talk a little bit about, I mentioned the emotions article. This is perhaps my favorite of the two, just because it's something that I think most people don't equate to being a good communicator. Okay, being able to control your emotions and being a good communicator. But in the easiest sense, we can think about, maybe with our kids or with a loved one or with relationships that we have or have been around, where someone communicates in a way that they seem to lose it. They seem to kind of get emotionally crazy. Either they get over anxious, or they start to yell, or they get overly emotional, as far as, kind of the bumbling, teary, type of emotion. These kinds of things can all get in the way, obviously, of effective communication. One of the things I mentioned to people, I used to, in high school, travel a little bit around the country, and not a lot, but I was in some different speaking competitions as a high schooler. This has been 20 years ago. where I, went to, out of state and traveled around for different competitions. And one of the things that people would try to compliment, of course, and I would say, actually, I used to be terrified of speaking in front of people, terrified of having conversations with others, to the point where at church, at church meetings on Sunday, at my church, you take turns giving like a little talk when you're young, and it gives you an opportunity to go up in front of all the other young kids and just give a very short thought, basically something from the scriptures, a story, something like that. And it's really simple, right? Nothing too complicated. They don't want to stress you out. Maybe 30 to 60 seconds is all, just a quick talk. Well, when I would be assigned to do that, because they just rotate, it was never by somebody volunteering. It was just a rotation. When I would be assigned to do that, it's not uncommon for a parent to go up, especially when they're really young, and stand next to them just to help them out if they get lost, or help them with their presentation. Multiple times as a young person, I would go up, get so terrified that I would start to cry in front of everybody, and then I would cry for so long that my mother, in this case, would end up giving the talk for me, and then we would go and sit down without me having said anything. So I'm a living proof that you can take just a fear, just a terrifying fear, a crippling and paralyzing fear of something, and if you practice it, it's kind of like we talked about, practicing the speaking and getting better at it. If you practice it and try and practice it more and more, you can get to a point where you can communicate. It doesn't mean you're going to be an amazing communicator at some point, but you can improve that, right? Quite a bit. So anyway, hey, thank you. That's just one of those things from my childhood that I think back and I just have to laugh. I can't believe how difficult that was and how easy it should have been, but how scared I was, And I think in every class like this, Jonna, I bet there are, if we've got a class of 40 here, I bet there are 10 people in a class like this that are just terrified to communicate in front of other people. Okay. I would even guess that, a half a dozen or so, the reason that they're taking online courses is so that they don't have to interact face to face with anybody, because they have some anxiety about that. And I'm here to tell you that doesn't have to be something that has to be crippling for the rest of your life. It might be, right, depending on your condition and your situation, but it doesn't necessarily have to be. It doesn't have to always be that way. But we can take baby steps and practice different communication with, first of all, people that aren't going to judge us and aren't going to ever be critical, right? People that hopefully love us and just support us, and help us to get a little better because they're positive and constructive. So anyway, that's a complete aside. But the reason I bring it up, oh geez, now are we talking all on like throw up, or are we, not to get gross here, but are we talking that, or do you just kind of gag and feel like you're going to throw up? Wow. Well, I am so sorry that's the case. Yeah. I hope that you will persevere through that. I hope that's something that you feel like at some point, speaking in front of a crowd or a group, that you can practice your way through it. Some people cannot, right? I'm not saying this is solvable or curable for everybody, but what I am saying is I think we can, with some practice. I know that's the probably the thing that in the world that you probably don't want to practice, right? But I think it is worth considering, how to do that. So, well, and church is a great place because, once again, it's a place where most of us don't feel, there can be some judgment, don't get me wrong, but it's just a more safe place, right? Where we sometimes can communicate without people coming after us or making us feel like we're lesser because of our skills, right, when it comes to communicating. So I think that's something that if you can do it in front of church, a church family, I think you're probably closer to being able to do it in front of other people than you think. But it might just take some more, right? Some more practice. And it's not something you have to do, but if it is something that at some point you want to be able to do that and kind of overcome that, I have full confidence that you could. Anyway, that's an aside. It does, and it doesn't necessarily. I kind of disagree that it makes perfect, right? But I agree with the premise, and that is that it allows us sometimes to overcome some of the fear. That's for sure. And you know, I would always, even when I was speaking in front of large groups and excited to do it, right? When I got more comfortable about doing it, I would still have nerves before, right? It didn't eliminate just because I was excited to do it and liked the opportunity to speak in front of people. At some point, when I overcame my terror about speaking in front of people, as a teenager, started as a teenager, I was able to do that. It didn't mean though that I didn't get, my palms kind of would get a little bit sweaty. I could tell my heart, was picking up a little bit as far as my heartbeat. And frankly, I think it made me a better communicator, to have those things happen. It's kind of the fight or flight, issue that happens biologically in humans. When we know we're going to kind of have to fight, and put on a show, our blood starts pumping a little better. We start to get a little bit of that, that energy that we need naturally in our body to make us a little better, I think. It's just controlling that, right? Not allowing that to get out of control, because that's the same energy and response that our body, that can get kind of swing out of control and force us to maybe throw up or cry like I did or whatever. So anyway, yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, most entertainers, speakers, famous people, let's say, even watching, sports icons early on in their career give a short speech to later on, it's a completely different thing. Or watching somebody give, an early performance, maybe somebody on, maybe you watched them on America's Got Talent or American Idol, when they were younger, right? When they were first getting in their career, and they're just terrified. And then as they practice more and as they perform more, obviously they get a little better and better and better, and they start to have what appears to be less nerves. Not that they've eliminated them, right? But they have less, and they can cope with them a little bit better. I've been in situations where, just because of the newness of the situation and kind of the anxiety about the newness of the situation, I find myself kind of tongue-tied, right? Like I can't communicate the way that I know I can. And that, once again, is just a situation where sometimes we have to kind of fight through that the initial couple times, and then it starts to get easier and easier as we do it more. Different for everybody, but something I know even from personal experience, that you can improve and really not even just improve, but you can get quite good, at something through practice, obviously, and speaking's no different. All right, so emotions. How can we learn how to control it? So based on the emotions you've talked about, Jonna, some of these things I think could be very, very good. Now, I didn't have this list, obviously, when I was a teenager trying to overcome my own, angst and anxiety about speaking in front of people. But some of the things that it talked about were things that I definitely did, unknowingly, right? Unknowingly, they were things that I did. And one of them was, I had ways for myself that I relaxed before a speech or a debate. My own relaxation kind of things that I would do for myself. I didn't do breathing exercises, but I think that would have been a really good thing to do. I definitely always had ways to clear my mind and stop and refocus on what I was doing. And then visualization, I would oftentimes, if I knew who I was going to debate against, or if I knew a topic that I was going to speak about, or if I could visualize a room or a judge that I was going to have, those kinds of things helped me quite a bit. So I completely agree, with these different tips on trying to, on helping us not only to make somebody who's just scared to death of doing it a little bit better, right? A little bit more bearable, but also somebody who's very good at speaking just a little better, right? And making them a little better by doing those different steps. So I think it's a great article. I hope you enjoyed it. I would encourage you to try some of them, right? Sometimes it's kind of hard to implement everything, but to try to implement maybe one thing at a time next time you've got somebody to speak in front of, and just see if you can't, eliminate some of those nerves and or at least reduce, like I say, or cope with some of those nerves that you have. All right, so that's that article, and that's just scratching the surface. I didn't want to give you the whole article, but I think it's very helpful, exercise to go through that article. Wow. You've come a Jonna, just being here having this conversation with me, even though it's not face to face, is a huge. You've made a lot of progress based on your comment there, and I think that's more common. Maybe not 3 years, right? I mean, that's pretty extreme, but I think that's a lot more common than people sometimes think, right? So sometimes people think that's just really, really rare. That doesn't happen very often. But there are a lot of folks who have a lot of angst about being in front of other people, being around other people. You know, and so anyway, well, I'm glad you got some help. I'm glad you had good people around you, and I completely agree with the first part because I think that's where I would give all the credit in my situation, is just help from others and help from above, to overcome things like that and to continue. So good work. All right, so a couple more things. We don't have a lot of time left, but I did want to point out some different things. And these are not from articles this week, but just different things that I think are really helpful. So in business communication, so important that we think about our professionalism. And why do I even bring this up? Because this is another issue associated with communication that is just so important and sometimes overlooked. And that is, how professional are we acting? How professional do we look? Because those things will taint or enhance the things we're trying to say. Okay? So when we talk about going in for an interview, right, with somebody else, a lot of people really get concerned about an interview, because this is where you're going to be put on the spot. You're going to have to communicate. You're going to have to demonstrate your ability to communicate ideas and thoughts. And it's whether or not you get a job sometimes, how well you can communicate with another person. Well, if you go in and you're kind of disheveled and you're not looking sharp, you're not looking professional. And sharp and professional can be very different depending on the job that you're looking at. It's not a suit every time. It's not a dress every time. It's not a skirt every time. It's not, it can be very different depending on what you're, interviewing for. But it still needs to be clean and neat and sharp, right? Because that image will enhance or detract from what you're trying to communicate, and greatly, because so much of that, we talk about how important first impressions are. Well, this might be the only impression that you ever get with that person, right? So you've got to try to accomplish, something that looks and feels professional. Then, even if your communication sometimes might be a little lacking, right? Because we're not perfect at it, we're not, masters at communication yet. Even if there's a little bit lacking there, sometimes how you look and act can overcome some of that. So know that it does enhance your communication. And just as a final aside, I think people who look and act sharp sometimes, it's a self-fulfilling thing. They actually speak, more professional, and they actually come across more impressive, even in how they talk, just because of, how they feel about themselves when they're looking sharp and good and professional. Okay. And just know that the way we dress and the way we look and the way we, act definitely influences, right, other people and how they interpret us and how our communication is taken. So just something very important to consider. Another just quick note on professionalism: be careful. We talked about different forms of communication last week on the discussion board, and this plays into professionalism and in a big way. And that is, your form of communication can say a lot about how professional you're being. Meaning, if I text somebody versus email versus face-to-face versus phone call, it's got all these options now in today's world in how to communicate with somebody. If you choose the wrong one, or if you chose a casual method or a non-detailed method when you should have chosen a more formal method and a more detailed method, sometimes that can really have be a detriment to what you're trying to communicate. And we can all come up with examples of this. Sometimes it's a little easier to find in other people than it is in our own decision making when it comes to choosing which one of those forms we should take. Sometimes we just use the easiest one, right? But we need to think through how that might be interpreted before we send that quick text or send that quick email that really should have been a phone call or face-to-face conversation sometimes, or vice versa, right? A quick message that's just going to annoy somebody, by interrupting or taking their time with, that's something that, should just be zipped over in a text or email so that we they can choose to read that communication or interact with us on their own time. And sometimes that's the very best way to communicate, right? It's not a good or bad, it's just different, forms for different things. I was going to talk a little bit about efficiency and how technology with communication allows us to be more efficient in some ways. And we talked about this a little bit last week on the board, so I'm not going to go into it in as much detail as maybe I had thought to. But I do want to talk a little bit about two different quick concepts that I think are very important. One is this concept of multitasking, and the other is a concept of if we were to do a 4-box quadrant, right? So draw a big box and then divide it into 4 boxes, okay? And those 4 boxes are, one of them would be labeled non-urgent and unimportant. One of them would be urgent and unimportant. One of them, so just the mixture of these 4 words, right? So you have 4 boxes, each one is a mixture of these 4 words, urgent versus unimportant and non-urgent versus unimportant. And what's the idea of this? It's a way to look at the different tasks that you have, the different things that you need to communicate in any given day as an employee or as a business owner, and then box those things into obviously these different quadrants, right, of the 4 different tiers that we have here. And of course, the things that are both important and urgent should take priority over everything else, right? But what happens for most of us in our work life, in our daily lives, is the things that are urgent and sometimes very unimportant can take precedence over things that are very important but non-urgent. I don't know if that makes any sense, but it's a really interesting exercise, both in what you accomplish at work and how you communicate at work, and also how you take care of things at home, with your family and maybe with your church, to try to think through what really is most important about this situation and what are the most urgent things and important things for this situation, and then make sure and prioritize based on that. And the reason I bring it into our conversation about communication is because I think it absolutely applies. If you're getting emails and texts and Facebook updates and all kinds of updates, right, from our device, right, our phone that we have with us all the time, sometimes that can feel urgent all throughout the day. But the problem is we can get in a situation, in a loop, where at the end of the day, all we've done were the things that we thought felt urgent from our devices, whether it's a computer, laptop, iPad, phone, all these devices that we have now. But in all reality, were very unimportant things, right? They felt urgent, but they were unimportant. So we have to be careful that our communication and our devices don't create urgency in our lives that doesn't need to be there. It doesn't need to create stress. We need to compartmentalize some of those things and hold off on some of those things that aren't unimportant, and make sure that we're really able to focus on those important things that we have. So kind of a time management concept, of course, and a business consulting concept, an efficiency concept, but it absolutely applies to communication, especially in the workplace, and making sure that those communication methods, especially email, texting, and IM, don't become so important to us when they're really not. They may be urgent, but they're not important, and we need to focus our workday on the important things, of course, and prioritize those first. So that's one point I wanted to make. Another point I wanted to make is there's a lot of new books or a lot of new literature, business management, type finance type books over the last few years that do a very good job of kind of debunking the myth that we all need to multitask. That makes us somehow much more efficient. Reality is, folks who do a really good job at what they do usually do not multitask. They focus, they're very good at focusing in on something, accomplishing a task, and then moving on to the next task, as opposed to trying to accomplish 5 different tasks at once and maybe not doing any of them very well, right? And that makes sense in our mind, but it's amazing how often we will try to have a deep phone conversation at the same time that we're looking at something on a device, at the same time that we're responding to an email. We're doing all these things all at once, and to organize our thoughts and really to be an effective communicator, we have to have the listening part, right, the understanding, the validation. All those different things have to happen. Very difficult to do if we're trying to multitask. So it goes back to that first article we talked about being a good listener. A good listener can't multitask while they're listening, right? A good listener is only about listening. It's only about the conversation at that point. If you want to be a good listener, you have to drop the idea that you need to be multitasking while somebody's talking to you, okay? John, I absolutely agree. And the funny thing about that is sometimes we do a lot of damage, right? When we're trying to, and it's all well intended, right? We're trying to just be efficient with our time. We're trying to do good things, all throughout the day, obviously, and keep on top of things. But what happens is when we're doing that, we can really complicate and cause problems with some of the most important relationships we have. Uh, it definitely can. It can make it worse. You know, one of the things, the conversations that I have with my wife a lot of times is that she'll speak with her mother, and they can multitask and talk at the same time because they're having a conversation, and none of it's something that they have to just be absolutely, you know, locked into as far as being just an amazing listener to, right? They can just be having a great conversation with each other as they're working or as they're doing something, active around the house or whatever. But when you're at work or when you're, trying to listen to something that's important, it may be worth considering that you may need to just stop, right? And think back to those listening tips that we talked about earlier from the article. I was going to talk a little bit about security within communication. I don't think we're going to have time for that tonight. We're about ready to wrap up. And I did want to just talk about a few concepts that I think are really important overall to communication. And we only have 4 classes together, right, Jonna? So I'm cramming a lot of information in with a lot of different things that we're talking about, but trying to get beyond just the articles too, because there's so much that we could talk about. There are classes, at campuses around the country, college campuses around the country that will go 3 days a week for an hour each for a whole semester, for 3 months in order to address the type of things that we're trying to cover in just 4 sessions. So we've got a lot of material that we could potentially cover and trying to get to as much of it as we can. One of the most important things I heard very early as trying to be a salesman, okay? This is, we're talking now 15 to 20 years ago. Somebody basically just said, look, no one's going to care how much you know until they know how much you care. And it applies to everything, right? Not just sales, not just trying to listen to what somebody's concerns or goals or aspirations are and then trying to match those. And that's what selling is, right? Trying to match what somebody's trying to accomplish with what you can do for them, whether or not it's a service or a product. If we are just trying to pitch them something and we don't even know what they're trying to accomplish, obviously there's a disconnect. And that person needs to understand that we're trying to help them. We're trying to accomplish something for them. We're trying to add value. If they don't understand that, if they think our agenda is the only agenda, that's where we, sometimes get that bad rap of used car salesman, right? Where they're just trying to ramrod us into something and they really don't care what is in our best interest. They're just trying to make the sale, make the commission, right? So none of us want to feel that way, or most of us don't want to feel that way. We want to interact with somebody that we feel like, and whether, some people are masterful at manipulating this, and I don't suggest that. I really think we need to try hard to have a genuine care before we can accomplish some value for people. The fail to plan to fail. Just in terms of communication, it can go a long ways to not have the approach of winging it all the time. Somebody gets fairly decent at communicating and then they sabotage themselves by thinking they can just wing it all the time. I'll take somebody who's not a really great speaker or highly effective communicator that has done a lot of preparation over somebody who does no preparation and just thinks because they're a great communicator they can wing it. That adds less value than the person who maybe isn't a great communicator as far as a great speaker, but has put a lot of preparation into what they're trying to communicate. And even, like I say, even good communicators need to put a lot of preparation into what they do. The best communicators, and we're talking, people that are in the limelight all the time, politicians, a lot of those folks really effort, their preparation before they get up in front of people and start to talk. And it sometimes it's very evident, that they really have put their work in and put their time and research into whatever it is that they're telling. Another line that I heard very early on, in a sales career was facts tell, stories sell. I absolutely agree with this. There is no emotional connection that occurs when you share facts, or very little usually. Some facts can be jarring, right? And elicit some reaction, but stories can elicit emotions almost every time, especially if they're heartfelt, genuine stories, real stories that people can relate to and people can feel. And when they feel something, then when we talk about trying to be, we want people to understand, right? But we also, what we're trying to say, was something I've been talking about since last week, is we also want them to not only understand, but we want them to remember and be motivated to do something about it, right? They need to be able to remember what we were trying to communicate, and they need to be able to feel motivation to do something about it. And that's where stories come in. Stories are easy to remember, they're easy to visualize, and they're easy to then be motivated by, especially a good story, right? A good video, a good movie, those kinds of things can have so much power because they're something that can motivate us to do something different, right? And really, if we're communicating and we're just a good speaker, but it never motivates anybody to do anything and they never remember what we say, how effective really was that, right? We want to get past just being able to speak well. We want somebody to learn something, perhaps remember something, understand something new, or understand something better, and then do something about it. Be able to motivate somebody to actually accomplish something. So effective teamwork begins and ends with communication. This is Coach K from Duke, and I think it's absolutely true. And yes, it's true on a basketball team, but it's also true in any team environment that you're going to be in. And almost every workplace environment these days is a team, right? So it's really important and critical that you have good communication lines between, your coworkers and colleagues. I like this one. Constantly talking isn't necessarily communicating. There are a lot of people who are, just talk, but really have very little substance because there's just very little substance. There's very little thought going into how they communicate and what they say. And then this is an interesting line. It's a double negative, right? It's kind of a weird thing grammatically, but that's why it's memorable. You cannot not communicate, meaning even if you choose to keep your mouth shut and never say a word, by choosing to do that, sometimes you're communicating a significant message, right? We're all communicating in everything that we do, our actions and our words, not just our words. And that's something important to always keep in mind. So anyway, just some important thoughts to me. I don't know if any of those stick out to you, Jonna, but whether or not they do or don't, I think if you find some things like these that you can kind of keep in your mind, they really can come, they really can help you out at some point. It sounds silly, but the facts tell, stories sell, and the fail to plan, plan to fail, and no one cares how much you know until they know how much you care. Those things are things that come into my mind quite a bit when I'm trying to communicate ideas with somebody else. And sometimes they really help me to change how I was going to message, something, and how I was going to communicate something. So anyway, I hope you have a great night tonight. Thank you, Jonna, for joining. Have a great week. Like I say, you'll have grades by tomorrow. If you have any questions or concerns, please be in touch. And just thank you for your participation. I really appreciate you. And we'll talk soon. Have a good night.